4 college students signed up for a sleepless experiment. Anyone who could stay up for 3 consecutive days would get 100,000 bahts. Anyone who could stay up for 3 consecutive days would get 500,000 bahts. For 7 days, the bonus went up to 1 million bahts. The experiment was well paid, but it was also challenging. Stick to it and you'll be worth 1 million bahts. If you can't hold on to it, you will die. Under the temptation of money, 4 college students applied for the experiment. Among them, Jane was a medical student. She studied hard, at the top of the class. Her parents had died in an accident a few years ago, leaving her and her sister orphans. To take care of her sister, Jane had to go to college and work at the same time. It was even worse when her parents also left a debt for her. The creditor came to collect the debt every day. Jane's hard work was not enough to pay the debt. For her sister to read, Jane decided to drop out after much consideration. After hearing about her dropout, the principal recommended a part-time job to Jane. A biological research institute was looking for a position for experimental testing. It was said that the pay was very high. The professor suggested Jane giving a try. This experiment was called the sleepless experiment. People were awake when the brain secreted the thalamus. According to the test, thalamus had a unique therapeutic effect on vegetative patients. The real purpose of the sleepless experiment was to collect thalamus. It was secreted only when the brain was awake. Once the human body went to sleep, thalamus would disappear. This required the experimenter to stay awake all the time. A chip was implanted into the brain of the experimenter. This chip was responsible for the extraction of the thalamus from the brain. The chip was connected to a watch value. The time display of the extracted data was on the watch value. Only when the watch value went to 100%, the experiment was complete. The experiment was divided into 3 stages. The experimental period of the first phase was expected to be 3 days. The reward was 100,000 bahts. This was undoubtedly a huge sum of money for Jane. She signed the contract without hesitation. When she left, the director of the institute reminded her to never fall asleep during the experiment. Once the brain was resting for more than 60 seconds, the chip would be short-circuited. It would force her heart to stop beating. After Jane left the institute, the experiment officially began. The first day she felt relaxed. Because she suffered from insomnia for a long time, she could stay awake for a day or 2. It happened to her all the time. Except for Jane, there were 3 other experimenters in the college. They were respective. Win was a club boy. Every day, he came to the club to have fun. Sin was a beauty blogger. She did live streams for her followers every day. The last one was Peach, a gamer. Every night, he played video games with his friends. All 3 had one thing in common. That was the lack of sleep. They were only active at night, clubbing, doing live streams and gaming. After a brief introduction, the 4 soon became friends. On the second day of the experiment, their watch value had reached more than 70%. Just one more night, they would get the job done. That night, each of them showed their ability, keeping themselves awake. Sin lived all night. Peach gamed through the night. Win had fun in a nightclub. Jane did housework all night. At noon on the third day, their watch value finally reached 100%. The experiment was completed successfully. The director brought them the bonus. All 4 easily earned 100,000 bahts. Jane used the money to pay off part of the debt. The other 3 started buying like crazy. Because the money came too easily, they didn't feel like it was hurt to spend it. It didn't take a few days to get all spent. The 4 of them had no money. The greed sent him back to the research institute. The temptation of money was too strong, making him agree to continue the experiment. The reward for the second phase of the experiment was 500,000 bahts. But the difficulty also increased. It was estimated that the sleepless time was 5 days. The 4 signed the contract. The experiment started again. The first 3 days were the same as before. It wasn't too difficult for them. But strangely enough, the percentage on their watch this time increased with a low speed. 3 days passed, the percentage only reached more than 30%. At this speed, it was hard to reach 100 in 5 days. Getting no rest at all for a long time, their consciousness started to get worse. One after another, there were auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. At this time, any slight sound in their ears would be magnified more than 10 times, becoming intolerable noise. Jane became irritable, getting angry with her sister all the time. By the 4th day, their physical fitness was close to the limit. Their faces were grey. They looked like the walking dead. The 4 got together and cheered each other. Jane found out by accident that the value of Win's watch had reached 50%. The other 3 were still around 40%. Jane thought the value should be related to the amount of human activity. Because Win often exercised, so his percentage went up quicker. They wanted to end this nightmare as soon as possible, so they had to work hard, using their body movement to stimulate their brain. In the evening, the 4 came to Peach's house. Peach was born into a rich family. He was a well-off second generation. He had always loved Sin. This experiment was also for him to get close to Sin. They held a party in the mansion, a pool party with restless music and cold pool water to stimulate their brain and keep themselves awake. But this was just carrying on in a short term. In a few hours, they were exhausted and began to daze. Win suddenly suggested he had some stimulants with him. Now, it was impossible to persist only by will. The passive intervention of drugs was necessary. They mixed the drug into the wine and drank it. They didn't drink for long, the drug began to take effect. Though their bodies were tired, their brain was very active. Everything in front of them constantly zoomed in and out, blurry and focusing. Along with the carnival, the watch value began to rise. At midnight, it was about 70%. When Sin went to the toilet, accidentally, she walked into Peach's bedroom. The bedroom was full of photos of Sin. These were all taken by Peach at college. Sin was anxious and angry when she saw it. She fainted to the ground. Her brain was dormant. The watch began to drop sharply. Jane and others immediately gave the first aid to Sin. At the moment when the watch was about to return to zero, Sin woke up with a thrill. They couldn't help crying with joy. It was a toss. They were sleepless. At this time, the watch value had reached 100%. The experiment was completed. The four of them came to the institute. They got their pay. The director wanted him to continue, because of the bonus in the third stage was up to 1 million bahts. The four of them all refused. This experiment had almost killed Sin. Compared with their existence, no amount of money could compensate. When the four came home, they slept all day and all night. This nightmare experience let them make up their minds. They would never take part in the sleepless experiment again. But what they didn't expect was that in the next few days, there were sudden deaths in college. Every student who died suddenly all wore the same watch. Jane suddenly realized that the experimenters were not just the four of them. It was said that people died for money and birds died for food. Facing with a huge amount of money, people were drawn in. But the scary part was still way behind. When Jane investigated, she found that her sister even participated in the experiment. Jane was very angry, denouncing her for making a risky decision. Now her sister had entered the second stage of the experiment. This stage was very dangerous. It was almost impossible to do it alone. Jane took her sister to the research institute, wanting to take out the chip. The director put forward a condition. After the test, at present, only the four of them had passed the second stage. If she wanted to help her sister retreat from the experiment, she had to come back with her friends, finishing the final stage. Jane could do nothing aside from taking the deal. She gathered the other three to discuss their trials. The expected period for the third phase was 7 days. This was far beyond the limits of the human body. Accepting the experiment was to find death. Except for Win, Sin and Peach refused directly. 4 lives in exchange for 1 person, they couldn't just take it. Sin and Peach left without saying anything. Jane didn't force them. After all, other people had no obligation to risk their life for her sister. On the second day, Jane and Win came to the institute to negotiate with the director. Though there were only 2 of them joining, the deal could also be accepted. Surprisingly, in front of the institute, Peach and Sin also came. After Sin's accident, the 4 of them had become real friends. There was nothing that could come between them, even death. The sleepless team regrouped, starting the third stage. For their safety, Jane asked the principal for help. The principal put them in a laboratory, giving them regular injections of nerve drugs. She hoped the drugs could stimulate their brain, keeping them awake. The principal regretted introducing Jane to the experiment. She just wanted to help her make some money to get through this. She didn't expect to push her into the abyss. But now, what had done was done. They had no way out. The laboratory was well equipped. The principal was in the office. Through the walkie-talkie, she kept in touch with them all at the same time. The first 3 days of the experiment, they didn't feel tired. After all, they got used to it. Under the stimulation of nerve drugs, the 4th and 5th days were also relatively easy. But on the 6th day, they had become tired. Due to the lack of sleep in a long time, their brains were congested and swollen. Hallucinations began to appear. At this point, the nerve drugs had no effect on them. They lost control of their limbs. Their bodies were on the verge of collapse. When Sin looked in the mirror, she found that her face was full of acne. She didn't know it was just an illusion, rushing out and complaining about Jane's selfishness and hypocrisy, sacrificing her friends for her sister. Their mood was extremely irascible. They didn't say a word, just slaughtering each other. Jane couldn't stop them. She had to run out and ask the principal for help. She went into a room in a daze. There was a monitor in the room. On the screen, her friends were lying on the ground. Jane flipped the file beside her. What was written inside surprised her. It turned out that the principal was behind the experiment. The director was just someone she had hired. Jane ran back to the lab and told the truth to her friends. The principal saw this through the surveillance. The door of the laboratory was closed. Now it was the 6th day. The 4 of them had to finish the experiment. Otherwise, there was only one dead end waiting for them. Jane begged through the walkie-talkie, but the principal shut down the call. The angry Sin picked up the tool, destroying all the cameras. At midnight, Win couldn't hold on at last. He fainted on the ground. The value of his watch began to plummet. In the critical moment, the principal heard Jane's call for help, rushing to the lab and taking Win out. After confirming that Win had no heartbeat, she took the chip off the back of Win's head. The chip digital was frozen at 16 degrees. The principal couldn't be happy for long. Win stood up behind her, knocking her down. Win was feigning death. As a medical student, the 4 were very familiar with all kinds of drugs. They found CCL in the lab. CCL could stop their heartbeats temporarily. The four escaped from the laboratory. Under the pressure of the public, the principal admitted everything. What she did was to wake up her sleeping husband. 20 years ago, her husband had gone into a coma because of an accident. The principal had studied for many years and discovered the magical effect of the thalamus. To wake him up, a huge amount of thalamus was needed. To collect thalamus, the selfish principal had taken away many innocent lives. The four then called the police. The principal was soon arrested. Her husband would never wake up again. This was the latest science fiction movie, Deep, I Had Done a Convert. 100,000 bahts was about $20,000. If there was such an experiment, would you willingly join? Leave a comment below. I'll see you next time.